I'm Penny Bryden, President of the Canadian Historical Association, and it's my pleasure to open this series of webinars on precarity in the profession. I do so from the territories of the Wasanich, Esquimalt, and Lekwungen peoples on the west coast of Turtle Island, and using a virtual platform hosted from the CHA offices on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. I invite everyone to consider their own relationship to the lands on which they live and work, and to reflect on the importance of real physical land as our contact with real physical people becomes increasingly circumscribed. The global pandemic that has limited our contact has also made clear the deep inequities in societies around the world, whether in death tolls among the poor, the racialized, and the elderly, or in the structures of our institutions and the distribution of advantages. Historians, too, have been unevenly affected by COVID-19. And so earlier this week, the CHA announced that it would waive its registration fee for students and precariously employed historians to attend Congress 2021, and would provide research support for students stuck in the archival limbo created by the pandemic. But beyond the immediate coronavirus crisis is a long-term shift toward relying increasingly on the poorly paid, poorly acknowledged work of a precarious workforce. History has not been the only discipline that has witnessed this growing inequity and has been party to its perpetuation, but it has been precarious historians who have led the call for change. Most particularly, they have done so with the publication of a manifesto that was unanimously endorsed at the annual general meeting of the Canadian Historical Association in June. Today, we open a conversation, a three-part conversation, on how to best address the issues of precarity within the historical profession. I have no doubt that the results of these conversations will surely be of significance far beyond the disciplinary confines of history. I'll now hand things over to the chair of today's session, Shannon McSheffrey.
Thanks, Penny. I'm Shannon McSheffrey. I'm coming to you from my personal satellite campus of Concordia University, located on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Kaniataka Nation. In addition to teaching medieval history at Concordia, where I've been tenured for several decades now, I'm a member of the CHA Council. People are tuning into this discussion from across the country and indeed potentially from around the world. Welcome to you all. I'm joined on this panel by 7 people who are going to talk about their experiences and their proposals for how we might handle the intertwined structural problems of, on the one hand, precarity amongst many of those who teach history in Canada, and on the other hand, inequities and lack of diversity in Canadian post-secondary history departments. As Penny mentioned, this is the first of 3 Zoom panels inspired by the Precarious Instructors Manifesto. The second panel that is going to be on Friday, the 22nd of January, same time as this one, will emphasize the role of trade unions, and it will be chaired by Nancy Janowiczek. The third will take place on the 19th of March. It will be chaired by Barrington Walker, and it's going to focus specifically on what the CHA as an organization can do. We're going to start that process, however, of thinking about what we can do today. These are difficult issues, and we're not going to entirely solve them with a single panel discussion or even 3 panel discussions. But we hope that this series will begin a constructive conversation about we from our different positions in the History Academy, especially in relation, in this particular discussion, to our roles within history departments, what we can do about them. To that end, Stephen High, who's Vice President of the CHA, has been the organizing force behind these panels. And he is also going to, in a sense, take on the problem of precarity as part of his portfolio as Vice President. He's going to begin the drawing up of a list of, in a sense, agenda items, recommendations and pledges, building on the Precarious Historical Instructors Manifesto, and continuing to add and refine through the course of the other panels. Our panelists today have also expressed interest in building, excuse me, I'm just going to try to change my slide here, on building on especially the desire of precarious instructors to band together across the country. And to that end, one of our panelists today, Murton Stoehr, is going to assemble an email list to begin that work of organizing. So if you are interested in becoming involved in that, then please send her a message at the email on the screen. Now, without further ado, we're going to launch into our panelists' contributions. We have 7 speakers, each of whom is going to bring a different perspective to the challenges of diversity and precarity. They're each going to speak for about 8 minutes or so. I think maybe Chandra, our first speaker, is going to speak for a little bit longer. And then we're going to open up the floor to Q&A. So at the end of the presentations, if you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the chat and we'll call upon you. Now, our first speaker today is Chandra Pasma. She's a researcher with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and we particularly welcome her here as, in a sense, she's a guest to the CHA as I think a non-historian. She works on post-secondary and precarious work files at CUPE. She is the co-author, together with Erica Shaker, of a 2018 CUPE report called Contract U, Contract Faculty Appointments at Canadian Universities. She's going to share with us some of her findings and conclusions about precarious employment in the Academy.
Thank you so much, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be joining everyone today from the unceded territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in Ottawa. I'm just going to start my slideshow a moment. There we go. So let me start by bringing greetings from CUPE's post-secondary sector. The Canadian Union of Public Employees represents over 70,000 members in the post-secondary sector from coast to coast, in colleges and universities, in nearly all job classifications, including contract faculty. So what I'm sharing with you today is some research that we did on contract faculty appointments back in 2017 and 2018. But it's part of our larger work on precarity, which is a problem throughout the post-secondary sector. So we know a lot about the experience of precarity for faculty through anecdotal reports and surveys, but what we don't know concretely is the number of contract faculty in Canada. Statistics Canada does a survey on faculty every year, but they only survey full-time faculty and provide information on rank, but not employment status. So you can get some information, but really not enough to provide a picture of precarity from that survey. But in all 10 provinces, if you are publicly funded, you are subject to freedom of information laws. So in 2017, we submitted freedom of information requests to all 78 publicly funded universities. There's been a few universities that have been created since then, but in 2017, there were 78 of them. And we asked for 10 years of data from the 2006-07 academic year through the 2016-17 academic year on full-time tenured faculty, full-time contract faculty, and part-time contract faculty. And we asked for that data to be broken down by both department and year. I'm going to skip over some of the details of how we analyze this data in the interest of time, but the data set that I am sharing with you today is based on 71 universities, or 91%. 56 of them sent 10 full years of data. 42 of them broke down that information by both faculty and department. 16 of them broke it down by faculty only. And 54 of them broke down at least some of the years of data that they sent. They broke down contract faculty into full-time and part-time. Because our primary interest was in the security of the worker, we grouped all types of permanent faculty together, whether they're tenured or non-tenured. Some universities have tenure, but also have a permanent non-tenured track, and some don't use tenure at all. All of those are grouped together. And then conversely, all types of contracts are grouped together. So it doesn't matter whether it's one semester, one course, or whether it's a full-time 3-year contract. If it's a contract with an end date, they're all grouped together. Most schools provided information on appointments, not individuals. 3 schools told us that they pulled out multiple appointments so that each individual only shows up once. But otherwise, an individual could hold multiple appointments and therefore show up multiple times. And this is something that I'll come back to briefly later. We assigned a subject area to each, or a faculty type and department type, where we had information on both. We used the department to assign the faculty to get around the fact that some universities have colleges of arts and sciences where they group all kinds of random things together. Or at one school, the history department will be in the humanities faculty, and in another, it will be in social sciences. All of this information comes to us as a black box. We have no way of verifying that what the university sent us was accurate. We have to trust them. But what we did do was look for anomalies in the data. So weird things we couldn't explain, sudden jumps, and we would take that back to the university and ask them to explain. In some cases, we were able to clarify and improve the data. In other cases, we excluded a year, or in one case, an entire university, because we just weren't confident in the accuracy of the data. So that's background. What does the data show? More than half of faculty appointments in Canada are contract. In 2016-17, nearly 52% of appointments in Canada were contract, compared to 48% tenure and tenure track. And this proportion has not changed much over the past 10 years. So we don't know when the shift happens from a majority of appointments being permanent to a majority of appointments being contract. We only know that it happened sometime before 2006. When we look down at the breakdown of contract positions between full-time and part-time, approximately 20% of contract positions are full-time, but the vast majority, 80%, are part-time. Reliance on contract faculty varies quite a bit across the spectrum of disciplines. So you can see in veterinary medicine, a very small number of positions that are contracts, and on the other hand, in continuing education, nearly all of the appointments are contract. For 9 areas, more than half are contract. And if you look at the 3 core subject areas that you can find at every university, humanities, social sciences, and science, or I should say nearly every university, there's a pretty big difference in the rate of contract appointments. So 58% of appointments in the humanities are contract, and that's where we put history in our analysis. 47% of all appointments in the social sciences, and 33% in science. When we break down the humanities by department, you can see that history actually fares better than many of the other humanities, although I just caution that there were only 32 universities where history was identified as a separate department, and the smaller your sample size, the less strong the data. When looking at provincial rates, Quebec relies much more on contract faculty than the other provinces. 60% of appointments in Quebec are contract. Ontario and Nova Scotia are also above the national average, and PEI and Alberta are both the lowest at 39%. But there's a few things that we don't know that could make a difference here as to why that is. And one of them is there something different going on with how appointments are done in Quebec? And as I mentioned, most universities send information on appointments, but Mount Royal initially sent information on both. And then after the report came out, a number of universities who had not provided information initially or who had sent incorrect information sent me new information. And I guess they did not like the conclusions of the report because they sent me information on both appointments and individuals. So you can see that at Concordia, there's a very big difference whether you look at appointments or individuals. And because Concordia sent me information with anonymized employee IDs, I can see exactly how many contracts an employee has. And I can tell you that they are all individual appointments every course. Whereas at Simon Fraser, you can see there's it's a much closer overlap, which means that the contract faculty are having appointments that cover an entire semester or year. And it's not each individual course. The other thing is that the provincial averages mask very large differences within each province. And I'm going to skip quite quickly over this again in the interest of time. But I've got 4 examples here within a province where you've got universities that have quite similar profiles, quite similar student body sizes, and yet you can see They have vastly, vastly different rates of contract appointments. And to me, that gets at the heart of the matter, what is causing this widespread reliance on contract faculty. The fact that it's most universities in Canada, there's only 9 where contract appointments are less than 1/3 of faculty appointments overall. So the fact that it's so widespread does suggest that the government funding cuts of the past 2 decades are playing a role. The university administrations, as they're getting squeezed, are turning around and they are squeezing faculty and staff in turn. However, a number of the other arguments that are frequently made to justify why universities are relying so heavily on contracts are just not held up by the data. So there's no pattern here at all that would suggest that contract appointments are about responding to market demand. There's no pattern where you see high growth areas where they would have to expand quickly, relying more on contract appointments, or low growth areas and the argument that they just can't afford tenured faculty anymore. It does not align that way. The data also doesn't support the idea that contracts are about the personal choices of faculty. When we exclude areas where professionals with day jobs are likely to be working, like the medical fields or journalism, the rate of contract appointments barely changes. When we look at the U15 research universities, they actually have a lower rate of contract appointments. So it's not just about permanent faculty preferring research and leaving the teaching to contract faculty. There's no pattern that would support the argument that this is about expensive tenured faculty refusing to retire, forcing universities to hire cheaper contract faculty. Instead, what the data really suggests, and the 4 examples that I showed you quickly really show, is that this is about the choices being made by university administrations. So there are universities in the same province receiving funding based on the same provincial funding formula with the same rules regarding tuition, the same market, the same location, the same geographical area, the same student body size, and yet they have vastly different rates of contract faculty appointments. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I'm happy to get more into some of what we can do about it in the question and answer period, but CUPE has made the whole data set available. If you're interested, you can download it by going to contractview.ca. You can look at the rates of appointments for your own university. You can compare it to other comparable universities. It's great for use in bargaining. And you can also download a copy of the report there if you want. And if you have any questions about using the data set, I'm happy to answer them. And you can reach me at cpasma@cupe.ca. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chandra. That was that is really going to set us up well for our discussion. Our second panelist today is Tina Chen. She's a full professor at the University of Manitoba, where she's been department head of history for over 7 years, and she's also currently acting as the director of Asian Studies. Tina.
Well, thank you so much. And, I'm, as Shannon said, I'm coming to you from Winnipeg. So the Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe Cree, Oji Cree, Dene, and Dakota people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And I'm so happy to be able to join this panel today. And I think my thoughts, first, thank you to Chandra for all that work. And I think as someone who's been involved in administration, I feel like this is the incredibly important work that all of us have to engage with at all times. And as we begin to think about, well, what are our responsibilities? Many on this list, I could see the participant list, have been or, currently are department heads or in their administration. And often it's a position where the question of how much agency we have to make change in the institution is up in the air. We often, feel like it's kind of a middle management place where you get told to do things, or you try and protect the space of department members to do the things they feel like they need to do, but how much you can intervene is a question. And I think today, my comments are really going to center around what, I like to think of in terms of a phrase of kind of administrative activism and the everyday politics that are involved in what we do and how we make choices, and to bring much of what Chandra has already presented to us into conversation with what our responsibilities are for thinking about equity, diversity, and inclusion in our departments and the transformation. And so I'm just going to sort of begin by saying that when I was hired at the University of Manitoba in 1999, there was one person of color who had just retired. And my hire, as far as I remember, I was then the only person of color in the department, and I was one of 3 women at that time. As I look at this, then I assume that I was actually the first woman of color to be hired into the University of Manitoba History Department, although these things seem to go completely unremarked upon by history departments. Interesting in and of itself. There's a discomfort there. The department that I've chosen to make my career in has changed significantly with hires in the 2000s. And I think that's because collectively there's been a very explicit decision to make equity and diversity foundational considerations, not only in the specific of the hiring processes, but the way that we approach and understand our department. And there's been much benefit on this. But certainly as I come to the end of 2 terms as a department head, I've learned a great deal about the structural conditions of precarity, unquestioned privilege, and everyday administrative activism that's required to inch things along towards what I can only think of as a less inequitable, along less inequitable pathways. And I'm also aware that as only the second woman to be the department head at University of Manitoba in the history department and the first person of color, that the burdens of speaking out, advocacy, and activism are themselves also not equally distributed. And so I think one of the things that we always need to think about are what are our goals and how do we interact with these? So I have a series of points that I'm going to touch upon in the time that I'm sure will be picked up later. So, I think it goes without saying that we live in a moment where everything we do, whether it seems like it's a small decision or a large policy driven, something that has larger policy implication, needs to be thought of through racial equity impact analyses and a general equity impact analysis in all instances. And I would say one of the things that I've learned is that this takes time and it takes work if we are always going to question ourselves about why we're advocating for something. And this is not just, this is about department heads, but it's also about individuals, whether we think we're advocating it within our faculty of the university. But often what we see happening is that we understand the inequities, we can see how they're come into place, and often it's about ensuring that certain people have access to it, and it often can come forward in an individual manner. So somebody else got released for something, that somebody else's contract position was converted, certain things, and the answer for these is often, well, then I should have this as well. And I think the one question that we rarely pause to think about is, how and why do we ask for the same? So if somebody has achieved something or gotten what we see as a benefit because of the ways that they worked through and claimed privilege and inequities, is asking for that same thing an act of addressing the inequities, or is it simply asking to be placed within that structure? And I think we often don't spend enough time asking ourselves that question. And it's a difficult question because on the personal level, those inequities are experienced, and particularly in the way that gender and race have operated within academia, both for precariously employed and for those with more permanent positions. These are the realities in which we often feel our lives, and they come to manifest themselves in the way. But we have to think about, well, when we ask for things, are we just inserting ourselves into a new structure without actually doing the work to shift that and considering them? Now, there's always the flip side. When we ask people to consider that, are we also asking people to sort of delay, access to certain resources? But I think for me, this has been a key aspect of it. And related to that are always the questions when we're thinking about this kind of and working through racial equity impact analyses and lenses, considering the kind of everyday question of how are we treating others? What are our expectations of others? Are we working in the kind of consultative mode that we understand to be a site of progressive transformation? Or are we also kind of bracketing off some of the ways in which we, kind of the lens that we bring often to our scholarly work, does it manifest itself differently in our everyday interactions? And so these are, questions that, again, we have to pause and ask. Here, I also, as I think about questions of precarity, always in my mind at the forefront are questions of process and collegial governance. We know that alongside the shift to a greater reliance and sort of and practices that have increased the amount of contract labor that sort of staff and deliver the post-secondary education are practices that erode collegial governance. And I would say, you know, we can't stand strong enough by and behind collegial governance, because one of the things that often we're reacting to within institutions like universities is the ways in which backroom discussions, sets of networks, places that kept certain voices out have created and continue to reinforce power relations that bring about inequities. And if we don't maintain those practices, take our time to participate in them, and also ask ourselves who should be in these rooms, who should be there talking, then we have a whole kind of series of practices that are problematic. And this is where this language of efficiency, overwork, of course, is a key part of this. How many times can we actually go to a meeting is also a question, but I'm really, you know, mindful that they kind of come forward in really specific ways. And in my department alone, you know, well, it doesn't, you know, it's not going to change the world. I always think of a really productive moment where we were like, our department needs guidelines on honoraria. We were like, why is it the practice that when we look at certain things, we also say, oh, you know, so-and-so is a really well-known and well-respected scholar. They have these titles, they have these things. Of course, they should be asking for an honoraria. We need $1,000 to do that. But so-and-so, no one really knows them. And we came up with a practice that if you're fully employed and it's part of your expected duties to actually be engaging with your colleagues, that there should be no honoraria. We have a nice gift, we give you a gift. Precariously employed, underemployed, other people who we need, whose expertise we want to see, though that's where the money should be going. These are only small actions, but these are things that think about when we take what are our decisions sort of, you know, exacerbating the division, allowing for privilege to claim access to resources, and then undervaluing others. And so, you know, again, these are parts that I think we need to think about, and then just our everyday processes. And then in my final ones, I would just like to say, and this is that all of us, I think, like to think that we want to do the right things, and that it is a lot of work, but I think important both in the administrative roles and then just the collegial interactions to always hold ourselves accountable for the ways that we use language of protection rather than empowerment. You know, and I say this because, you know, many of the places where people begin to experience precarity and inequities are not just at the undergraduate level, but as graduate students. So there's language of who gets to speak for the students. And are we doing students a service or a disservice when we actually place ourselves institutionally to speak for them? And I guess here, you know, I think it's about the lessons that we need to learn from anti-racism advocates. We need to really think a lot more about what allyship and being a co-conspirator mean and how we put those into place, because protected spaces can't be about paternalism. They have to actually be talking to those that we seek to work with. And that's why I think this panel is so important, and asking them how, where, and why we need to advocate. What is it that they feel like we can do when we use our positions of privilege? Someone like me who's been a department head, you know, and as a full professor, I can have a voice in certain places, but I can't presume that people want me to use that voice in specific ways. And I think that this kind of conversation is absolutely necessary, because there are so many situations where people believe they're speaking for others. And that this becomes part of the language of, well, you know, they don't have a voice at the table. And what we can do in administration is actually provide them that space, not actually claim the space on behalf of them, but just actually ask for the change and bring those voices forward. And then finally, I think my last point will be, at this particular moment, administratively, and for all of us as historians, I think, you know, we will all need to work together much more to think about the ethics of collaboration. And I say this as someone who's a specialist in Asian history, where the field is confronting what have now been multiple years of lack of access to archives within a COVID situation, which for many, I think, is a little bit new in this moment. But, you know, I think about it as we sit on this panel again, and we have Chandra present what is a fantastic set of resources for all of us. But when we think about collaborative work and the way that we're going to become more and more reliant on it, we not only have to think about how questions like tenure clocks, recognition, awards, things that help you move into more permanent and secure employment, how those are attentive to the inequalities and inequities that are going to be part of this moment in terms of access to research and ability to complete that research. So how privilege is going to be reinforced in particular ways, but also the desire to, you know, provide funding to people to ask for help in research. But are we doing this in an ethical mode in which we're actually truly collaborating? Or are we moving into a way that, you know, looks mighty like imperialism, where we look for those who can do the research, and then those who have more permanent employment get to sort of do the analytical, theoretical work and put it forward. So what's her role between those who are doing the work of research, providing it to us, and then what work do we do with this? And I think there's a serious question right now around this ethics of collaboration and where we move forward. And that must be my time. Shannon is probably going to put hers up. The dogs say I'm done as well. So I
sent
will
a message
stop
to the
there.
dog. Okay, thank you, Tina. That was many things for us to think about, and a timely reminder also of what the specific situation that we're all living through right now with the pandemic, how that's going to affect where we're going forward. Our third speaker is Crystal Fraser. She's a Gwich'in, originally from Inuvik and Dachanchu Genjik in the Northwest Territories. She currently lives, works, and plays on Treaty 6, the homeland of the Métis Nation. She started a tenure track position in the Department of History and Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Alberta in January of this year. Crystal.
Yai Dringweenzi, Shori Crystal Gale Fraser Vilji. Hi everyone, my name is Crystal Fraser. I'm Gwich'in, originally from Inuvik and Dachanchu Genjik in the Northwest Territories. As Shannon had mentioned, I have the pleasure of living on Treaty 6, the homeland of the Métis Nation. And if you could see outside the confines of my camera right now, you would see many boxes piled high because we have just moved. So I am learning and exploring a new relationship with land that is new to me. I will say that my nation and my ancestors have had a long relationship with Cree, Métis, Lakota peoples in this region for several centuries, through trade, through governance, through marriages, and most recently, forcible relocations through institutionalization at the Charles Camsell Indian Hospital, which still stands here in Edmonton. So one of the things that I think about every day as I do my work is the indigenization of universities. And the question in particular that I ask myself is should this be done? What are the implications of this choice? Is this being done in a good way? We have now seen widespread agendas for indigenization, which was tied to reconciliation. Some of that is through new hires, like myself, for which I'm very grateful. From what I understand, I'm the first Indigenous hire since the Department of History employed Olive Dickinson, a renowned Métis historian. And then a few months later, I had the great pleasure of welcoming Sarah Nickel to the team at the U of A, to the Department of History, Classics, and Religious Studies. And currently at the U of A, we're undergoing a massive restructuring through the UCP and the county government cuts. Administrators are whittling down 18 faculties to as little as 3 divisions. So massive restructuring that is really happening at this breakneck speed. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is that this is just such a wasted opportunity at the U of A to, not undergo community consultation, not undergo restructuring of governance, not consulting Indigenous nations and communities in this area extensively to see what kind of an academic institution the U of A should be. And Chris Anderson, a leading scholar in the field of Indigenous studies and the current dean of the Faculty of Native Studies at the U of A, recently gave a talk about this restructuring and about how universities have moved forward on this agenda of reconciliation and indigenization. And one of the key things that he put forward was that universities in Canada have chosen to go towards the path of inclusivity. So how is it that we can make these spaces less hostile, less violent, some might say more welcoming to Indigenous students and other students of color, instead of entering into good relationships with Indigenous communities that would allow us to talk about how it is that we can change the colonial fabric and backbone of Canadian universities. So I think a lot of these conversations are really happening on the backs of Indigenous scholars, but also largely confined to the discipline of Indigenous studies. And personally, I would like to see that change. I would like to see more historians and other academics from other disciplines start to weigh in on these things, so we can have, you know, a robust conversation about the kinds of learning environments that we want to provide to students, but also the places that we work. So as a recent graduate student, I suppose, I defended last fall. I can definitely speak on my experiences of someone who, you know, just went through the system. That makes it sound like prison or something, but it was not. And my work looks at the history of Indian residential schools, specifically in the Inuvik region of the Northwest Territories. And for me, this is a family history. This was also a topic that my community and elders cultivated from the proposal stage. And my mother went to Grolier Hall in Inuvik. My grandmother went to Immaculate Conception in Aklavik. I also had an aunt who died there at that school. And from what I found, just my own experience, is that as a graduate student, I was finding that academics, from my perspective, were leery to delve into these kinds of histories. Granted, this was nearly 10 years ago now, but this sense that they're too controversial, you know, at that time the TRC was underway. And so one of the things that I really found lacking was a safe space to have conversations about histories that are meaningful to me personally, but also on the national scale, you know, and indeed there were places to have certain conversations about residential schools. But, you know, even 5 years ago, you know, being asked the question at conferences, well, surely something good must have come out of them. You know, look at Indigenous leadership in politics, and those aren't necessarily, oh, there's a deer. There's a deer running through my yard. Sorry, I'm living on 23 acres now, and this is the first time I've seen some wildlife here. So providing students the places to have serious, rigorous conversations with each other, with seasoned academics, in a way that is not violent or does not take into question their own families' experiences. I know I'm probably running out of time, so I will make this brief. My work with archives, and archives have been a big conversation, especially over the last few years, I think, with decolonizing archives. Archives were again not a friendly place for Indigenous researchers or Indigenous histories. The whole process at Library and Archives Canada, it took me about a year to be able to view anything. And so I I applied for a number of records. About a third were a complete no. You absolutely cannot look at those. Those are too sensitive. A third were redacted beyond belief. They were illegible. And then another third were indeed made available to me, and I flew to Ottawa. We all know how expensive that is, and I had planned on staying for a month. Ironically, the TRC had contracted out scanning for those archival records at the same time, and the scanning company had indefinitely checked out those records, and so it was a wasted trip to Ottawa, and just the inability of, or rather the refusal of the scanning company to work with me to try and make those records accessible, held up research. You know, the length of time that is needed for careful scholarship and relationship building is often, you know, not acknowledged by funders, by SHC. I do believe changes are coming. The president of SHC was at the U of A earlier this week and met exclusively with Indigenous scholars. And I mean, finally, as someone who is very junior, I haven't even been on the job for a year. Of course, I'm looking to advance my research agenda, and now, you know, with COVID-19, the Northwest Territories borders have been closed since March. And for me to continue to build these relationships, to move my research forward, to do meaningful and ethical consultations, and to have, once again, a community-driven research project is falling by the wayside. I don't know when that's going to change. And some of you do know me that I'm not really a historian of the archives. I do oral histories, and I spend time on the land. I go to my fish camp. I hunt for caribou, and so as we move into how my year has been assessed, how I go into my pre-tenure years, I'm not sure what that looks like. Yeah, so I think I will leave it there. Hi, thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to the question period.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And again, we end on the difficult question of you know, what is the pandemic going to be doing to us all? But just a reminder, of course, for those of us who, you know, who've been around for a long time, that the primary burdens are going to be falling on those who are newer to the profession than people like me. Our fourth speaker this afternoon is Catherine Murton Stoehr. She's a non-Indigenous writer and historian living in Nipissing Territory, also known as North Bay, Ontario. She studies and supports the Anishinaabeg anti-colonial struggle. Catherine.
Thank you. Thank you, Shannon. I feel a little concerned that there is that Dr. Fraser just shared quite a bit with us, and that it doesn't feel right to rush on, particularly when the topic of what I have to say is not unrelated, but not related in a way that I have the skill or the wisdom to relate it. And so I just want to say thank you for sharing the stories that you shared with us. I heard them, I attended to them. I am certain that the folks on this call attended to them. And maybe if they know how to work the emojis, they could demonstrate that. But and if you have more to say, I'd love to hear you, and any solidarity that I can provide to you. I'm over here in North Bay. I'm speaking to you from Nipissing Territory. Some struggles happening there, and I just send out my love to my neighbors and my friends over there. Chandra, you don't know me, but I see you. I see what you just did for me. I am aware from the newspaper of some of the circumstances in your life, and I'm kind of blown away at what you just did, and your kindness and your generosity. So respect. I am a lifelong organizer. That's one of the things that I like to do. And I find it interesting. Oh, and I'm also a lifelong, or my entire career as an adult has been working contracts at universities. And I find it interesting that at the age of 46, this is the first time you're seeing my face on this issue. And I think that that's because I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk to you about it. It is a subject that I find acutely painful and embarrassing, which is a euphemism for humiliating. And also kind of a bummer. So I want to say thank you to my friends Al and John, who spent time I didn't have over the last couple of days on the text machine with me. You guys are good friends, and beers on me. I will talk about precarity though, because that's what I'm here for. I have followed the path of this Precarious Historians Manifesto with a kind of awe. I love this manifesto, I love its strategy, and I love its insistence that we attend to the immediate sufferings of contract workers, and at the same time, think about those in terms of the larger political circumstances and struggle. I like how it also gives folks the tools. It doesn't just say, you guys are the worst. It says, here's some problems, real problems, and here's real things you can do about it. And I like that it's written clearly by people who know how universities work. So it's not pie in the sky. It's stuff folks can do with the tools that they have to hand. I think a lot about how we got here. So work inequity at Canadian universities is as bad as it is in other sectors. And yet, our acceptance of it seems to be more. This idea that we would have a profoundly two-tiered system of pay and benefits is normalized in a way that I think it isn't in other sectors. And I think about that a lot for personal reasons, because I don't want to believe that my colleagues like me less than other people's colleagues like them. And I think it's also pretty unlikely. So I've thought a lot about why we got here, and why, for example, we didn't shut down the universities long before we got to the place where many people, many highly trained people, are working 4-month contracts on close to minimum wage. Why, for example, is this a panel discussion and not a national strike action planning meeting? And my sense is there are 3 beliefs that authorized and continue to authorize the exploitation of contract workers at universities. The idea of contract work as apprenticeship, the centrality of tenure in our understanding of remuneration at universities, and the belief in the meritocracy. Sessional teaching was once, at least in part, a teaching tool. It was part of an internship. It was an experience that was in and of itself valuable to people who would then take up permanent jobs. This is no longer the case. People like me spend their entire careers working these predatory contracts. And the response that I have heard in various forms is, well, it's not supposed to be this way. It shouldn't be this way. This wasn't the plan. And people shouldn't work those jobs for their whole careers. And the unfortunate fact is that I absolutely do exist, and I'm not the only one. There's hundreds, thousands of people like me, except like me and queer, like me and subject to racism, like me and suffering from food insecurity, like me and living in cars, like me and suicidal. People like me working these contracts are legion at Canadian universities. So by all means, let's wrest the steering wheel away from capitalism and take back control of the universities. But we cannot let people twist in the wind while we play the long game. My second point is that I think, or I fear, and this is total projection, so go ahead and tell me that I'm wrong, that when people hear someone like me say, I would like your solidarity in fighting for better working conditions, I am afraid that there is a non-zero number of people who hear notably unproductive historian Catherine Murton Stoehr feels entitled to a tenured position at a Canadian university. I'm going to ask you to not hear that if that's what you're hearing. I'm going to ask you to consider that there is a lot of daylight between a tenured position at a Canadian university and 4-month contracts at minimum wage. And that, speaking for myself, and I suspect others, increasing my total income year over year and increasing my job security are what I want. And that there's a lot of room between this point and that point for improvement, for harm reduction. The meritocracy. I heard some buzz about this after in some of the discussions about the manifesto. I don't know if this is hilarious. This isn't nice, but I heard one professor said, if there is no meritocracy, does that mean I'm not smart? No, it doesn't mean that. Y'all are smart. We're all smart. That is not the problem. Over the years, I've heard many variations of contract instructors aren't faculty. The department is us, not them, meaning the people with permanent jobs. Or I once heard an associate dean say, I want to be very clear, I support tenured faculty first. Or as an actual dean once said to me at a party, he was explaining to me why a student who was doing research on a project I was leading was being paid and I was not. And he said, with a chuckle in his voice, Catherine, you know we care about the students. We don't care about you. The unspoken foundation of these statements that gives them the cast of respectability is the belief that contract instructors are not exploited workers, but rather defective workers. We aren't at the table because we failed the entrance exam. When tenured faculty say these things, when full-time workers are quiet, when others say these things, both inside and outside of union meetings, that is not authorizing or acquiescing to my exploitation. That is advancing it and strengthening it. So what do we do? I have already alluded at the outset to one of the biggest challenges to organizing on this file. Staying on topic, no one wants to talk about this. The affected workers find it humiliating and depressing, and fear, I think, that it will harm their reputations. Full-time workers find it, even the ones who want to help, I think find it just exhausting. This is a file that is not moving. It appears to be intractable. This is the ugly baby of justice struggles. And here I'm going to be a historian for a minute and remind my colleagues that we can talk about this. We can talk about this a lot. But it's not, at the end of the day, all that complicated. This is not intractable. It's only intractable if all possible actions aren't on the table. And at the moment, I think it's pretty clear that they're not. We know how change happens, and it doesn't happen from a few well-chosen words at a faculty council meeting. We have the right to strike, and permanent faculty have more protections on their right to strike than others. Those protections were bought for us by people much more vulnerable than us, people who were also committed to other justice struggles, people who had families. They faced bullets and batons for that right. And if we fail to use it and watch what they worked for be stripped away around us, well, we are squandering their sacrifice. As we take this up, I want to flag a concern, which I think Dr. Chen, thank you so much for your words. Dr. Chen already flagged it. There's a good thing that's actually a bad thing. So full-time faculty, because they are paid for service, which is important, obviously, actually have that time, can choose to put some of that time toward this organizing effort. And folks like Chandra and folks who work at the unions, again, it's great that they have this full-time, or that they have time paid to do this work. But as yet, I have not seen a structure or like a durable way for those folks to take our leadership, to find out what we want, to put themselves at our service, if you will. And that's because we have the institutional life existence of fruit flies. It is very, very hard to organize us. It is very hard to talk to us, and it is very hard to take direction from us. I happen to know, I have been working on this for a few years now. So that's a logistical problem. And if anyone has insight onto that, gosh, I would love some guidance on that. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't reading the notes. Apologies. Actually, that was all I really wanted to say. I want to close with a word to the workers on the call. Shoot me an email if you want to get involved in some organizing on this, or if you just want to be in relationship with people who are organizing and you don't quite have time, that's fine. And hang in there. Take care of yourselves. You're not alone. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine. That was really going to be, I think, very useful for us going forward in this conversation. And I think what we really want to try to come out of this conversation is with some really concrete things that, you know, that we can at least start to do. And I think that you can, you know, you can start to think yourself about, let's try to think of some things that everybody can do, like something really concrete as we're getting out of this conversation. Okay, our fifth speaker is Ian Mosby. He's a settler scholar of the history of food, Indigenous health, and the politics of settler colonialism. He's currently an assistant professor at Ryerson, but between 2011 and 2019, he was precariously employed in a whole range of part-time, temporary, limited term, and contract positions to make ends meet. Ian.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm coming to you from Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat territory. I want to start by saying that I'm feeling very emotional watching my fellow panelists and following after Catherine, in part because I think I share what Catherine was saying. I don't want to talk about this. It's embarrassing, but it's also, it was, you know, if I could describe what it was like to be precariously employed for 8 years, was that it was devastating on a daily basis. Constant feeling of failure, constant worry about what was going to happen in 4 months, in 8 months, in a few weeks, regularly being unemployed without having any access to unemployment benefits because of the nature of precarious employment. And so, you know, part about, I think, what I want to get across today is to really have you think about the toll that this takes on your colleagues, the toll of precarity, the toll of being on the job market, the toll of just trying to continue to do your work in this thing that you love, that you've devoted most of your adult life to, and facing these working conditions. You know, just little things, the sort of the subtle cruelties of our profession sometimes. I thought about the, you know, however many dozens and dozens of jobs I applied for. And the, you know, I can't even count how many of them would ask for you to do extra work just to apply, you know, design a course, write a specific statement on what we're trying, you know, on this specific job that we're looking for. And to do all this, and then to know that you're one of, you know, however many, you know, hundreds of people who are applying for this job and then never getting the interview. You know, I was interviewed twice by history departments in those 8 years, one of which was the job that I currently have at Ryerson. So it was all rejection, all down the line, it was rejection. And then the insult to injury is, you know, suddenly it's like, okay, well, I can apply for postdocs, I can apply for funding. And then you start to look, and the funding's actually limited to, you know, you can only apply if you're within 2 years or 5 years or whatever out of your PhD. Or you can apply for funding, but you can't actually pay yourself with that funding. You can pay other people. And these are minor cruelties that I think our entire profession had for far too long, and sometimes continues to do without even thinking. The sort of unthinking cruelty of the way we treat those who are not on the tenure track. And so one of the things then, looking through the manifesto and thinking about, what we're talking about today, there's a lot of questions about, well, what can we do? Well, I just named a few things that you can do. You can, the manifesto even says, when you're posting a tenure track job, don't ask for anything more than a cover letter, a CV, and a name of references. Don't ask for references to be sent for the 100 people who you're not even going to be looking through most of their applications. But I think there's also these structural issues we need to talk about. There's this, the neoliberal university, the funding cuts are an acute cause of what is happening and our precarity crisis. But departments have choices that can be made, and departments are not making those choices. So think about if you're in a department right now that is accepting PhD students, ask yourself whether it is acceptable to be accepting new students in the context where the vast majority of those students will not be getting academic jobs. And you can say, okay, well, a lot of these students are coming into PhDs because they want jobs in other fields. This is great training for those other fields. Number one, I actually don't think that's true. I think an MA is great training for non-academic jobs. I think a PhD is actually terrible training. And if you want to prove me wrong, do some studies. There's been so little research done into this whole idea of alt-ac, these alternative academic careers. Of course, people who get PhDs go on to do other jobs, right? But it's not because of the PhD. There's not proof that is the causative relationship. Getting a PhD will get you this excellent job. And in fact, I would argue that it's probably not true. And so this is one of the things we can ask, what can a department do right now? Well, let's get some data. And this is also for the CHA as well. Do we have any data on the number of students who are going on to academic careers, the types of, the percentage of students who are getting academic careers? Are you providing that data upfront to incoming students? Are you collecting that data? If not, why not? And in fact, the fact that we don't know a lot of this data, the fact that we had the wonderful presentation at the beginning, but that our own historical profession hasn't been collecting that data, and yet has been telling us in a lot of senses that we're looking out for you. We're looking out for precarious historians. We're doing all this stuff. Well, there's some there's some things we can do. We can start collecting that data. So I think right away, departments should be, especially departments with graduate programs, should be actually collecting and publishing data. And if you're going to start telling your students that the truth, that they're not getting an academic job or the chances are extremely low, you also need to change your MA and PhD programs to recognize that this is no longer to train upcoming historians and make them shorter. Make the comprehensive exams process less of a cruel punishment and a hazing, and make it actually functional. These are things that departments can do, that it's not universities forcing us to do. And we, as members of departments and tenured and tenure track people, we can make decisions to help our fellow precariously employed colleagues, our future colleagues. And, these are things that we can do as the CHA as well. And so I don't want to take up too much of people's time. My main goal was not to start crying, because the main thing that my experience was of being precariously employed was, like I said, it was devastation. And I do remember at one point, after talking to my psychiatrist, who I mostly started to see because of the mental health issues that came with being so precariously employed. After he turned off the clock, he said to me, he said, "You have to quit academia. It's killing you." And the fact that academia was the cause of so much pain and misery, it doesn't have to be that way. And I think it's something that we can all start to think about, the humanity of our colleagues and trying to help them and trying to make our profession a better profession, and stop passing the buck. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ian. And I have to just, acknowledge, I guess, that, especially Crystal, Catherine, and Ian, all three of you have, really laid bare your souls. And, anyway, it's very, for those of us who have, sometimes been unthinking, those of us in, tenured positions and things like that, I hope we, become somewhat more thoughtful at least. All right, our last speaker is John Lutz, who is a full professor at the University of Victoria, where he's just completed a 5-year term as department chair. He's also served 2 terms as a member of the CHA Council and is currently in the advocacy portfolio. John, I think, is going to talk about the department end of things. John?
Thanks, Shannon. Thank you for hosting this discussion, and thanks very much to Stephen High for organizing this. Can you all hear me and see me? Somebody nod, because I don't seem to have you on my screen. Yeah, yes, okay, great. That's great, thanks. I also want to thank CHA President Penny Bryan for prioritizing this issue of precarity with the CHA and for establishing this webinar series. And I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Cowichan and Wasanich people on Salt Spring Island. And finally, I want to thank the speakers we've just heard. I've heard Ian and Catherine and Crystal and Stacy all talk about the toll and the subtle cruelties and mental health challenges. And I thank them so much for sharing, and I'm so sorry for their experiences. I acknowledge up front that the university system is not a meritocracy and that our contract colleagues are being penalized by a systemic discrimination and not because of anything they have done or failed to do in their academic lives or their careers. I was invited to speak from a perspective of the department chair, and because my time is short, I want to focus just on one element, and that is that, well, given union contracts and Senate guidelines and all the kinds of administration that ties universities up in knots, departments don't have a lot of flexibility when it comes to the issues of precarity that we're discussing today, but we are not, as departments, we're not powerless. So I'd like to talk about 5 spaces for advocacy and amelioration, what Tina nicely called administrative activism, and what Catherine called harm reduction, academic harm reduction. Just a little bit of context, we don't have a lot of contract staff at UVic. We call them sessional instructors. About 10% of our faculty are sessionals, contract. They teach about 20% of our students. Structurally, of course, we depend on these colleagues who are paid less, have less security than the 90% of the rest of us. And I echo what the others have said, Catherine and Ian and Stacy, that and what the manifesto says, departments benefit from an historically unprecedented multi-decade internship, a broken 2-tier system. So having acknowledged that, what are the things that departments can do? And I'll just give 5 examples from the UVic experience and then think about some others that have been proposed. So the first is that advocacy or activism with our deans and our colleagues. And at UVic, I have to say we've employed this strategy with some success for our contract workers. In the last 7 years, we've converted 3 of our long-term sessionals into tenure stream faculty. For 2 of those, the mechanism for that was essentially going to our dean and our vice president academic and making the cases on the basis of equity, on the cases that we need those employees to teach those courses. They've been teaching them in many cases for a decade or more, and there was just no reasonable excuse not to convert those positions into what we call tenure track teaching stream positions. So that was one strategy we've used to some avail. Advocacy with our faculty association for language in our contract has been another strategy, and here the faculty association in fact took the lead at UVic. I don't claim any credit for our department, but in our most recent faculty agreement, our faculty association, we are unionized here, bargained for a $150,000 fund that would pay the cost of converting some continuing sessionals into a teaching stream, into a tenure track stream. Now, it's not a lot of money, but it was a breakthrough because the faculty association at UVic doesn't represent sessionals, they are members of CUPE. And so here it was one union essentially giving up their bargaining or opportunities for better health care or tuition credits for their dependents in order to try and address redress this huge inequity that we've been talking about. $150,000 fund turns out not to do a lot for continuing sessionals, and it also highlights the disparity between contract employees and tenure track teaching stream. It turns out it costs $50,000 basically a year to a difference between those two positions. And so the fund only created 3 conversions across our whole university. Departments had to make a case why one of their continuing sessionals should be converted into teaching stream faculty. And in the history department, we had excellent colleagues, and we were able to make the case that one of them should be converted. So as I say, in the last 7 years, we've managed to make 3 of those appointments kind of tenure track. One place the chair does have lots of flexibility, at least in our university, is teaching assignments. And in our department, teaching our continuing sessionals, our contract employees are consulted about what they'd like to teach every year. They propose courses they want to teach, and every effort is made to avoid assigning them new courses, obviously, to avoid creating new preparations for them. I should say that we have, let's say, still ongoing 4 contract employees, and I think they've all been on staff for more than 10 years. We also try to schedule their courses to accommodate their family and other requirements, as we do with all of our colleagues. The 4th strategy that we've used is classroom numbers, in recognition that our continuing sessional colleagues teach more sections than the tenure track faculty. We cap the class size of lectures for our sessional staff at 60, while we cap the class size for our tenure track colleagues at 90. So in recognition that they're teaching up to 8 courses, where the rest of us may be only teaching 4 or less if we have other releases, we cap, their caps are lower. And finally, I think this is important, and it comes to speaking about some of the sort of subtle cruelties that Ian spoke about. I think our department culture treats continuing sessionals as best we can as full members of the department. Our colleagues have full rights of voting and participating at our departmental meetings. They're encouraged to attend departmental meetings. They have equivalent office space to all the rest of us. They're invited to attend and do attend department social functions. So we consider them members of our department and treat them with the respect that any colleague deserves. And so those are the 5. I say 6. There are other suggestions for the departments that have emerged from Ian and Stacy and Catherine today, also in the Precarious and Historical Instructors Manifesto, which our department certainly can kind of move on and take up, and I recommend them to my other tenure track colleagues. So in sum, sessional colleagues are essential to the running of our program. They are long-term, highly skilled professionals, and the system that we place them in is clearly broken. My main point is that while departments have little flexibility or ability to change the whole system, they do have the ability to ameliorate some of the worst conditions sessionals, contract employees face, and we all have the power of advocacy for our colleagues. And that power has allowed UVic so far to bring 3 of our 7 contract employees across the Great Divide into the tenure stream and to do some ongoing harm reduction. But of course, there's lots more we can do. Thanks.
Thanks, John. I think that some of those, or all of those suggestions are extremely useful. And I think that one of the things that we should consider, the departments should, or sorry, I'm sorry, that the CHA should consider doing is to create a series of like CHA recommendations for departments. And I think that that's something that maybe we should come out of this whole process with, and that will be, I think, very helpful. I've put back up the slide that I had at the introduction that includes, and this is specifically for you to see again, especially if people who joined a bit late, that Catherine, yes, who just pointed to herself, is putting together an email list of precariously employed history instructors who want to work for change. And so if you are interested in that, then please send her a message at Murton Stoehr, all one word, at gmail.com, MurtonStoehr@gmail.com. Well, we are coming really to the end of 2 hours here. And so we've had very useful conversations here, I think, and they can be ongoing. And of course, we have the other 2 the other 2 sessions that are going to be happening in January and March, where many of these themes can come up again, I'm sure, with a different twist. I would like to end again by thanking Michel Duquet, the Executive Director of the Canadian Historical Association, Stephen High, Vice President of the CHA, who organized our 7 panelists. I feel Penny Bryden, the president, for taking us in the beginning, and especially I think let's all have a round of some kind of virtual applause, whether you have the little hands coming up on your emoji or you just do this yourself, to everybody who talked today, and the emotional weight of what it is that was said today was really heavy. I'm certainly going to be thinking about it for a while. So thank you to everybody. Au revoir in January.